Well, we all know, don't we, the reasons why the United States intervened in the Gulf the way we did. In the end, killing between 100,000 and 200,000 Iraqis, as opposed to 303, I think, Americans killed either in combat or in combat-related accidents. And we certainly have restored to power the legitimate authority in Kuwait. In fact, we've done it applying that age-old, all-American political principle of one man, one vote. In this case, one man, the emir, one vote, his. We heard Bush back in August, didn't we, at the very beginning saying that our way of life was at stake. We had to do something about that invasion of Kuwait. We also heard, didn't we, besides the way of life was at stake, we had to intervene to protect the access to the energy resources of the Persian Gulf. Another one was that we had to stop naked aggression. What we did not get are alternative interpretations of the events that occurred. And that's what I want to speak about here tonight. It's my opinion that the United States needed an international crisis, an international threat, to replace the crisis in Europe that largely disappeared with the collapse of communism and the chaos in the Soviet Union. Why? In order to keep the permanent war economy going, to justify continuing the situation wherein well more than 50% of the federal budget goes to military purposes. Well, this means that the military expenditures in the United States are the motor of the U.S. economy, and they have been that ever since about 1950. It's worth reviewing the history because that's where this crisis, I think, comes from, this sought-for, needed crisis. In early 1950, there was extreme worry at the highest levels of the Truman administration that the United States was likely to return to the conditions of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so early in 1950, the decision was taken that this domestic economic problem was going to be solved through militarism. That is, through rearmament in the United States and through U.S. financing of the rearmament of Western Europe, particularly Western Germany. The document which provides the analysis of the world at that time and the U.S. place in the world and the internal situation in the United States was top secret for 25 years. In 1975, it was accidentally or through error released and published. It is known as NSC 68. It was written by NSC, standing for National Security Council. It was written by Paul Nitze, and it is a very detailed document. The main operative conclusion, though, was this. This is a quote from the document. The United States and other free nations will, within a period of a few years at most, experience a decline in economic activity of serious proportions unless more positive governmental programs are developed. Well, the solution adopted, those more positive governmental programs, was expansion of the military. But Truman could not get this program through Congress at first. There was opposition there and public opposition to the enormous new taxes that this program would require. He went on national radio, declared a state of national emergency, and said what Bush's remarks about our way of life being at stake reminded me of. He mustered all the hype and emotion he could, and Truman said, among other things, he said, "Our homes, our nation, all the things that we believe in are in great danger. This danger has been created by the rulers of the Soviet Union." In his speech, he also called for massive increases in military spending for U.S. and European forces, quite apart from the needs in Korea. Well, there was no threat from the Soviet Union. They were still rebuilding from the rubble of World War II, in which they had lost 20 million people. They were no threat, but they were manufactured from 1950 on, from the time of Korea on, as a grave threat to the United States. And that became the justification for this program, which Truman, through manipulation of the Korean War, had been able finally to get through Congress. The result was that in the first 2 years, that is the 2 years between 1950 and 1952, the U.S. military budget more than tripled from $13 billion in 1950 to $44 billion in 1952. And during the same two-year period, U.S. military forces doubled to 3.6 million people under arms. This was the beginning of the permanent war economy in the United States. The Korean War, by the way, went on for 3 more years after it could have ended. In the end, 34,000 U.S. were dead, more or less, more than 100,000 wounded, and the total casualty count was in the millions. It is worth recalling that because from 1950 on, the Soviet threat was the justification for the permanent war economy and the justification for these enormous military expenditures. What does that mean as far as the United States is concerned? Well, it means that we have not addressed or begun to solve the many domestic crises that we all know exist. There's no need really to go through this litany of the worst educational system in the developed world. 1 in 3 in this country illiterate, either totally or to the degree that they cannot function in a society based on the written word. Healthcare, not just the cost, but the fact that 40 million people in this country have no health insurance. The only developed country in the world with no national health plan. And on and on. The fact that only about, 60%, about 2/3 of the eligible voters register to vote. And of those who register, only about 80% actually vote, so only in the end, 50% of the eligible voters vote in national elections in this country. And that means that a president is elected with around 24-25% of the potential vote. The litany goes on: the environment, the infrastructure, finding a prevention and cure for AIDS, the violence we see everywhere and in every form in the United States. When you put all these things together, I don't think anyone would argue, add drugs, of course, anyone would argue that we have a domestic society in profound crisis. And the reason why over all these years these crises have not been solved is, in my opinion, because those who really control and rule the United States don't want them solved. Imagine what would happen if we had an informed electorate, if we didn't have the worst educational system, if we had a negligible, perhaps, illiteracy rate here. There might be an informed electorate. We might be debating real substantive issues in the electoral process or in the political process in the United States. There might be a threat in this country of real democracy if we solved the domestic crises in this country. People might clamor to participate if there was a real debate. There might be a threat of a third party, I mean a second party in the United States. There are all kinds of threats to elitist control of the United States if we were to solve these domestic crises, in my opinion. And it is for this reason that we have always needed this foreign threat and this foreign crisis in order to justify putting the money into military expenditures instead of converting the economy once and for all to human purposes. During those 40-odd years of the Cold War, the CIA has been a very important factor or tool or instrument of the President of the United States in waging what is continuing today. This new world order of George Bush, or new international order, seems to me to be nothing more really than the institutionalization of the north-south dimension of the old Cold War. That is, the war against the Third World for control of their natural resources, their labor, and their markets.